Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ sanghaṃ namasami. So this is Sutta class number 1 for Vasa 2022. And I think it's helpful sometimes to be able to hear for you or to go through the Buddhist teaching somewhat systematically. So since we take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, I start off with explaining a bit about the Buddha, then the Dhamma, then the Sangha. Probably, hopefully I get it finished by 12 weeks, is it? Minus 2 for retreat. So Sutta, as many of you know, I think, refers to the Buddhist the discourses the Buddha gave, which are recorded in the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon is the collection of Buddhist discourses, teachings, collected in the Pali language for the Theravada school. So this collection is fairly extensive. I think in the English translation is about 38 volumes. And the bit of the history of the Pali Canon, in the very beginning, when the Buddha was teaching, things were not recorded. They were not recorded on paper, but by memory. So when the Buddha gave a discourse, the listeners would have to remember what he said, and then they'd review it. You know, when they're out in the forest meditating, they would be able to review his teachings, rather than depend upon a book which got eaten by termites. Well, there wasn't any material to write on anyway in India at that time. There was no papyrus. Yeah. It took a long time, till the teachings went to Sri Lanka in 88 BC before they're written down on palm leaves. So the Pali Canon was remembered for nearly 500 years. It'd be remembered, and then the monks would pass it on to the next generation. And there was a whole system of different sort of groupings of monks. There was very few who could memorize the whole Pali Canon. Apparently there is today in Burma, there still is a few monks who can memorize the whole canon and repeat it. But for most of the monks, it was a bit too much, so they specialized in different. Maybe one did the Sutta Nipata, and one did the Samyutta Nikaya or then Anguttara Nikaya, one different section of the scriptures. And they'd try and repeat this over and over again, and then be able to pass it on. And so the result of that is that there's a bit of a particular style to it. One is there's quite a few repetitions, which was very helpful to remember. And the other one is there's quite a few stock phrases. So sometimes the scriptures seem to be a little bit, I don't know what, but be careful what I say. I don't want to be, sacrilegious, but sound a bit stodgy or something. It's not a bit formalized or a bit rigid, just repeating the same formulas over and over again. And it's, if you've ever heard Dhamma teachers talk, of course, maybe there may be some kind of repetition, but generally they try to, talk depending upon the situation. So depending upon the people they're talking to, be quite, you'd just say, just kind of have to ab lib, just make it up as you go along, with probably a certain theme maybe going through it. And then nowadays people don't like repetitions, so maybe we just have to kind of shorten it a bit. And that's what many of the translators have done when they translate the Pali Canon from Pali to English. They just put what they call ellipsis, I think, ... repeated again, the same formulas. Like in the 5 groups of grasping, they talk about the body, the body is impermanent. Then the feelings are impermanent, and go through the whole 5 again and again and again. It's helpful to remember, but it is also very good to be able to reflect upon it too. To keep it in your mind very, very deeply. Oh yeah, right, this one and this one and this one too. And so when the Pali Canon was translated, nowadays I think most of it's done in English now. And the style can be a little bit unusual for us. But basically, it's been held to be basically a record of the Buddha's teachings, as far as we can ascertain by history. The Indians didn't have such a concept of history as we do in the West, of actual dates, or even like the Chinese. The Chinese kept a very careful record of this date and that, this happened on that date and that date. But in India it was mixed up with, kind of the prehistory, and then the kind of mythology and a bit of tradition, and so it was not very precise. But through tracing archaeological evidence and cross-referencing with other scriptures, they have been able to determine roughly that there was somebody around in about that time, 5th century, 6th century BC, who was very influential and had a big following of people. Well, not so big then, but it gradually grew. And so there's evidence of a historical Buddha. But, there's some archaeologists have uncovered some of the stupas and found some relics that say they don't say the Buddha. He had a number of different names: Sakyamuni, the sage of the Sakyans, and kinsman of the sun, and various other names. He called himself the Tathagata. So I don't think the Buddha was not really used very much in India at the Buddha's time. He was called Bhagavan, the revered one. I don't think even Buddha is mentioned. His name, Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, is mentioned. But Buddha actually means the awakened one. So it was like a title. And then, people began to shorten his, the teaching of the sons of the Sakya became Buddhism. The ism of Buddha. And then there's lots of history with that too, so it can be very complicated. But for I think most people are interested in what the Buddha was actually teaching, not so much all the historical facts about it. Because over the years, of course, things, even in the Pali Canon, I would say, some things got a bit distorted. In Bhikkhu Bodhi was probably the most prolific and well-known translator today, still alive. And even he has some little notes in his translations. There's a line missing here or something. Oh, this doesn't make sense. I think there's a corruption in the text here somewhere. But there's enough repetition and enough, comprehensiveness to the Pali Canon that we can make out the basic teachings. So we come to the Buddha himself, an historical figure, and there is no comprehensive history of the Buddha in any of the Pali Canon. One has to search through different parts. There's several discourses where, in the course of a conversation with somebody else, he mentions about some of his austerities he practiced and his history, and then the beginning of the Vinaya text, there is it continues a kind of historical account of when, after the Buddha was enlightened, then the beginning of his teaching, like the founding of the Sangha, if you like. Otherwise, we have to kind of patch it together from various places. But there is generally considered to be a historical figure called the Buddha, and he lived in central, would be north central India, born in what is now southern Nepal, a place called Lumbini. And then he did most of his teaching in the Ganges Valley in northern India, central North India. It was called the Middle Country. And at that time, there was the dominant religious culture was the Brahmanic tradition, which later it became Hinduism. That was the most common religious group at that time. And it was a great variety of different expressions of it. The most common were the Brahmin priests, who led you can say, well, some of them led a very worldly life. They were very wealthy merchants, wealthy politicians or something. Some were appointed to be overseers of certain areas by the kings. Others were the ascetics, the matted-haired ascetics, fire-worshipping matted-haired ascetics. And if one goes today to India, one will see a great variety of different practitioners. Some still have the matted hair and recite texts, or different practices, yogic practices, and so the Buddha was, and at the time, socially speaking, there was the 4 caste system. There's 4 castes, quite rigidly enforced, like social groups. There was the Brahmins, top of the caste. Then there was the Kshatriyas, or the warrior caste. Then there was the Vaishyas, who were the merchants and traders and tradies, I guess you'd say. Then there was the Sudras, the low caste, the laborers. And only the Brahmins were allowed to study the sacred scriptures. And the lower castes weren't allowed even to listen to it. So there was quite a rigid structure about who could learn the scriptures. That's why it was mostly an oral tradition. You had to go to your teacher, the Brahmin priest, and you had to ask him for teachings, and you received the special directly from him. The not secret teachings, but secret for the Brahmins anyway, not allowed to the other people. But the Buddha was a Kshatriya, so he wasn't bound by this rigid caste system so much. At least not the religious part of it. He wasn't a Brahmin, so he one of his radical changes was he allowed any caste member to come into the Sangha, even the so-called untouchables. He didn't discriminate between anybody in any caste. Anybody who had the interest and the yearning for spiritual awakening, they could join the Sangha. It was a little bit controversial at the time, you can imagine. But anyway, the Buddha being a Kshatriya, he was outside the Brahmin fold, but that was still a very, very influential religious group. So that kind of set the foundation, or set the basis for how he could practice, you see. So anyway, the Buddha is, historically, the modern historians, they say the Buddha lived between 563 and 483 BC, but the Theravada tradition makes him even older, 60 years previous. So he died in in 543. That's what we get now as a Buddhist era, 2565, right? 543 and 2022. Yeah, right, I got that right. All my years at university do pay off. Didn't even use a computer. But in the Pali Canon, the Buddhist is placed not so much historically in India, but he's one of a whole lineage of Buddhas. The Pali Canon, they mention 7 different Buddhas. Gautama Buddha is the 7th. There were 6 previous ones. And the Buddha just more or less followed a similar pattern, seeking for the deathless, seeking for the truth. He followed a certain path and then found a way to awakening in a similar way as the previous Buddhas. So the Buddha just said, I have found an ancient path. He didn't make it up. Just as this Buddhism isn't, so-called New Agey. It's a very, very deep history. Yeah. And there were other previous Buddhas who also awakened to the similar experience, you see. But we won't meet them probably. We didn't meet them. And we didn't even meet the last Buddha, did we? The next one, if you're lucky. So anyway, the Buddha, he was a young man in India. Well, he was born into this Kshatriya tribe, Kshatriya caste, into a small tribal republic in North India, or southern Nepal. And some people say one of the stories is that he was a prince from royal family. No, it's not right. He was a son of a tribal chief, because the Sakyans didn't have a kingdom. The Sakyans were a tribal republic, a small tribal republic in the north part of India. And there was a number of these tribal republics, and then there was a few kingdoms. Magadha and Kosala were 2 main kingdoms. So Buddha was a son of a tribal chief. And, while it kind of maybe some people think, well, being a prince is more, more famous, more dramatic. But it's a very important point, because when the Buddha set up the Sangha, he followed a republican form of government for the Sangha, not an autocratic, monarchical one. Monarchical? Monarchs, autocrats. So it was a republican form of government, and the Sangha is set up on a almost democratic form of republican government. It's called a consensus democracy, which is very high ideal. However, this was kind of moderated by the respect that people had for the elders in India at that time, in Asia today still even. People have a certain unwritten respect for the elders who've been around and have experience. So every single Sangha member had 1 vote. From the most junior monk to the most senior, he had 1 vote. But because there was a deference to the seniors, they tend to get a bit more, have more weight to their vote, put it that way. So it kind of offset a little bit of the kind of democracy bit, but so the Buddha was a prince. Of course, he would have set up as a monarch. He would have been the king of the Sangha, see. And unfortunately, over the years, the kingdom model has become more prominent. So even today, like the senior monk in Thailand is called the king of the Sangha Raja. But he's kind of elected into that post. He doesn't inherit it. He doesn't inherit it from his father. You don't get the joke. Yes. If he's in the Sangha, you don't have fathers and children, you see. You aren't married. Anyway. But he's elected to the post anyway. So, but they use the word Raja, which in India at that time just meant senior person. And in the Sakya Republic, it meant the tribal chief. But later when the monarchies became more prominent, they began to expand. The tribal republics got overridden. There's a story in the Pali Canon about how Ajatasattu, he was the son of King Bimbisara. Bimbisara was a very loyal disciple of the Buddha very early on, but Ajatasattu overthrew him, and he wanted to expand his empire, you see, so he attacked the Vajjan Republic, and he conquered them apparently by sowing discord. Yeah, and then they expanded, and I think Magadha, it was a Magadha kingdom, became eventually King Asoka's realm, I think, eventually. Dominated most of northern India at one time, time of King Asoka. But anyway, the Buddha was a Kshatriya, so I mean, when he was a young man, he was, you could say, even he wasn't the prince, but he was kind of a spoiled son of a tribal chief. So he had quite a privileged life. It says he had 3 mansions for different seasons, and had quite a few luxuries. He had a sheltered life from the world. He didn't have to go off and be a laborer or anything. So when he was in his early years, he had a kind of like a spiritual transformation, you can say. Confronted with old age, sickness, and death. And this is kind of it's kind of embellished into what they call the 3 heavenly messengers. The Buddha's riding out in his chariot, and he sees an old person. And what's that? What's an old person? Never seen one before, because he was sheltered, you see. I think in one of the scriptures, Sutta Nipata, there is a reference to when the Buddha's born, a Brahmin sage came. I guess they would invite the religious people to come, and he didn't baptize the Buddha, but they would come and, do some kind of blessing for him or something. And this Brahmin must have been I think it was an ascetic, a sage they called him. He looked at the Buddha and said, "Oh, this person is destined for greatness," he said. He'd either be a world-turning monarch or a Buddha. And of course, his father would like him to be a world-turning monarch and get more power. So he sheltered him even more from the vicissitudes of life. So even more sheltered. But, can you ever be sheltered from the vicissitudes of life? Always something happens. So anyway, he had a confrontation with old age, sickness, and death. And it was sort of, romanticized into this confrontation, the heavenly messengers. And then he began to think and contemplate, if life was just all pleasure, no problems. It just becomes complacent. But old age, sickness, and death slaps you in the face. And wake up, there's something else here. Your life's going to end in death. Fun's going to end in suffering. So he was a contemplative-minded person, I would say. So he reflected upon it, and then he was quite troubled by this. But then he saw a religious person. He was wandering around. The ascetics would wander around collecting alms in the villages and in the towns. And so he saw somebody, who's that? Oh, he's somebody seeking the truth. Oh, there's a way out of this. There is a possibility. So anyway, then he left his comfortable life. His wife had just given birth to a child, but he abandoned his child and his wife and his family and his rank and everything, and shaved off his head and went off into the homeless life, which was, at that time, it was very valid, although, like I say, he was homeless, so he was cutting off his social ties, really. He was becoming a homeless one. I mean, it's like somebody with no caste, cast off. It's quite a dramatic thing. I mean, there's very little chance to come back again, be a prince, be a son of a tribal chief again. It's over. Very dramatic, very severe, very extreme renunciation. But he's very sensitive and contemplative. He's very determined, and then he went off seeking the way. And traditionally at that time, there was several options available. First of all, he went off to seek a teacher, meditation teacher. So he sought two different teachers, Udaka Ramaputta, and what's the other one? Akali, no. Anyway, two other ones, two of them anyway. He sought them, and he practiced meditation with them, and he practiced with the first one. He attained the highest level with the first one. The first one said, "Oh, you are very, accomplished. You can become a teacher." He said, "No, but this isn't the way to awakening." He thought, "I'll try another one." Went to another teacher who taught him next higher level. And that teacher also praised him and said, "Oh, you're very well high attained, And he said, "But this is not the way to the deathless. It's not the way." And so he had to go off on his own. The other alternative was ascetic practices. The traditional, asceticism they did, not only in India, but, the early Christian monastics also fasted and went without sleep and lived in the cold and the heat and all kinds of things. And if you want to read the gruesome details, I can give you a few passages in the scriptures. Majjhima Nikaya 26 and 36. The Buddha explains all the different practices he did, freezing at night and baking in the sun, meditating in the boiling sun, and eating very, very little food. So apparently he practiced these austerities for, quite a long time, many years. But then one day he was so exhausted, he went to get up to go to have a bath or something, and he collapsed. He said, "Oh, this isn't the way either." This isn't working, So then he decided he had to change his whole approach. So you can say, and then the next part was he kind of broke away from the traditional practices and had to find his own way. So he had to be very original too, find his own way. So his way was that he happened to reflect upon a certain time when he was meditating, like a young child, entered into deep absorption. And then from that point, he also could reflect upon his experience of old age, sickness, and death. So what's the cause of this? He began to contemplate. What's the cause of death? The cause of death is birth. And so he was meditating in this way, and again with determination and with diligence, under the Bodhi tree in a place called Bodh Gaya in India. And he was meditating, contemplating these factors. What's the cause of death and birth and aging, and he followed back with very, very sharp mind, very calm mind which had been very, very highly developed in meditation, and he realized, got back to ignorance. It's the fundamental root cause of suffering. In India at that time, the Brahmanic tradition, maybe even the other ones too, other traditions, there was, traditionally there was mentioned 6 different teachers of different sect. Everything from determinism to agnosticism. The only 2 that can be really traced to historical records is one called still alive today, still today, they have what they call the Jains. Jains. They practice non-violence, ahimsa. Harmlessness, actually, even more extreme harmlessness. When I was in India, I saw a few of these Jains. One was a couple of Jain nuns I saw walking in the road one day. They had masks on their face, without COVID, pre-COVID, white masks, and they would sweep in the road before them, you see. because they didn't want to breathe in any insects or step on any insects either. So they broomed the road in front of them when they walked, before they walked. And the Jain monks, at least one sect of them, so there was a belief in India of the Atman, some kind of essence of a human being, which united with, became also synonymous with Brahma, the external ultimate reality too. But the Buddha was searching, investigating his different aspects of what we call dependent origination, the cause of death was birth, cause of birth was becoming, craving, grasping, craving, feeling. By reflecting in that way, he just saw there were just processes. There was no thing called an Atman, an essence. Empty processes going on. So that's when he came to the realization of what we call anatta, no permanent self. And in that process too, before he got to the awakening, that was his awakening then, he also went through deep meditation, through the three knowledges. The knowledge of his former existences, and then it says when this knowledge was attained, ignorance was destroyed and knowledge arose. Darkness was destroyed and light arose. Accordingly as I dwelled, vigilant, ardent, and resolute. But such pleasant feeling as arose persisted without gaining power over my mind. And then with the mind thus composed, purified, cleansed, unblemished, without defilement, malleable and workable, steady and immovable, I directed my mind to the knowledge of the passing away and arising of other human beings. So you could also be aware of other people's, we can say, karma and vipaka. With clairvoyant vision, the second knowledge. And then the third knowledge was the knowledge of dukkha, suffering, arising, passing, the path, and that became the third knowledge he attained in the third watch of the night. Ignorance was destroyed and knowledge arose, darkness was destroyed and light arose. Accordingly as I dwelt, vigilant, ardent, and resolute. But such pleasant feeling as arose persisted without gaining power over my mind. So when he had this awakening experience, then it was quite a powerful, profound change of perspective. I would say it's a change from, we grow up with a perception of things in the world. Things, we see objects, but the Buddha had realization of processes. So, the so-called Atman, the essence, rather than being a thing, it was actually a process. Yeah? Can you be aware of processes? Then maybe you're enlightened. Most of us are programmed to look at things, right? Rather than just looking at, say, this recorder here. We think it's a thing there, but it's actually there's a whole process there. There's different parts work together, batteries and power and different things come together. There's no thingness to it. It's just different parts working together to function, you see. So the Buddha had this profound realization, which was very, very different from most people. So first of all, he enjoyed the bliss, apparently, the bliss of his awakening. So for 7 days, he just sat under the Bodhi tree and experienced bliss. Then he went to another tree, and they say for 7 days, he sat under 7 different trees and had different experiences. And then after the 7th tree, reflecting about, what should I do next? And he thought, well, people can't understand this. This is too profound. So he realized that, say here, he realized that it was this path was too comprehensive, too complicated, beyond dialectic, and that it would be very, very difficult for people to understand it. People who were caught up in craving and, you'd say, always perceiving objects, they couldn't perceive process, if you like. That's my interpretation. But then, as he was reflecting that, he said, "Oh, people can't understand this, so I'll just sit in bliss for the rest of my life." But then, one of the Brahma gods, apparently they saw this situation, they heard the Buddha speak, or heard the Buddha think this thought anyway, but oh no, the world will be very, very disappointed and suffer from this, so I should ask the Buddha to teach. I would say, it probably comes from a higher level of consciousness or something. The devas, the Brahmas, are higher level of consciousness, so something in his mind said, "Oh, I can be selfish and just sit in bliss," or there's a higher calling. Maybe I could try and do some teaching. So he decided, okay, I'll give it a try anyway. So then began his teaching career, if you like. Career? He didn't plan that, but very, very nice simile here. Just as in a pond of blue lotuses or a pond of red lotuses, only a few blue ones or red ones are born in the water, grow up in the water, do not rise above the water. But only a few of them, they rise above the surface of the water, untainted by the water. Therefore, the Buddha addressed the Brahma, opened all the doors to the deathless. For those who hear, let them show faith. Considering vexation, I incline not to teach, which is excellent for human beings, Brahma. Anyway, the Buddha was encouraged then to begin teaching. So he decided, first of all, who he would teach. And while he was doing his ascetic practices, he had 5 disciples. The 5 Panchavaki, they call them, the first 5 disciples, who had abandoned him when he he started to give up his ascetic practices and eat solid food again. They thought, oh, he's given up, he's a slacker, he's not going to practice anymore. So they left him, abandoned him. So he realized they were staying in Isipatana in Sarnath. Buddha walked gradually from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath. Must have taken about a week, I guess. He had 2 months from his awakening in full moon of May to the full moon of July, just passed. So he had some time to walk there. So he arrived in the deer park in Isipatana, and the 5 disciples were there meditating or doing ascetic practices, and they saw him coming, and they said, "Oh, let's not pay respects to him. There's a slacker, Gautama, But just the Buddha's appearance, being radiant, and so he approached them, and they couldn't help themselves but bow down to him and say, "Oh, welcome." So anyway, then he began his teaching. He gave them the first teaching was the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. That's about the middle way between sensuality and self-mortification and the Eightfold Path. And the discourse itself is a little bit, I would say, a little bit formalized, but at least it lays down the very basics of the Buddha's teachings, the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the middle way. And once the Buddha had given that teaching, one of the ascetics became enlightened. Anyata Kandanya was the first one. Having seen, reached, known, and penetrated into Dhamma, having crossed over doubt, without uncertainty, have attained perfect confidence in the Master's teaching, without depending upon another, said to the Reverend One, "May I, sir, receive the going forth in the Reverend One's presence." And so he was the first disciple the Buddha received as a monk. And gradually the Buddha stayed there, and through the rains retreats, I guess it must have been, it was a time in the monsoon season in India. So even though it wasn't a formal Vasa retreat like the monks have now, probably most of the ascetics, they settled down to one place because it was raining a lot. So they were there together, so the Buddha taught them. And the second discourse was the Anattalakkhana Sutta, we will do next time, the cardinal discourses about the teaching of non-self, and then gradually all of them, 5 disciples, became enlightened. They all realized the truth. And then began the beginning of the Buddha's setting up the Sangha. Next, the Buddha was staying in the deer park, Isipatana, and then this layman came along who was very disillusioned, a very wealthy, son of a wealthy merchant. He was also a bit disillusioned with the world, and he met the Buddha. The Buddha gave him a teaching. His name was Yasa. And he was also quickly enlightened. And that's for the going forth. Not long afterwards, 54 of his friends came along. They heard about him, he'd gone forth, so they went to inquire what's going on here. So, first of all, it was Yasa's father and mother, and I think his sister or somebody were also enlightened, but they just asked for refuge, to go for refuge. They didn't ask to join the Sangha. But 54 of Yasa's friends eventually came along, and the Buddha gave them a discourse, and before they know it, there was 61 arahants in the world. That's when the Buddha told them now to go out wandering and teach for the welfare of human beings. So they spread around the North India, and then 30 more friends who the Buddha met in the forest. They also ordained. Then the Buddha met the 1,000 matted-haired ascetics. These are Brahmanic ascetics. And they worshipped fire. They had matted hair, and they lived near the river, Uravela River, I think it was. And there's 3 brothers, the Kassapa brothers. So they had their different. One had 500 disciples, one had 300, one had 200 disciples. Anyway, there's quite a long explanation of how the Buddha related to them, and it was finally through an act of psychic power, the Buddha finally impressed them enough that they asked for some teaching. So, and they asked for the going forth first. So they already were ascetics already. They already knew about most monastic principles. So the Buddha quickly ordained them. Then he gave them the fire sermon. All is burning, very, very cleverly, because they were their former fire worshipping ascetics. So now the Buddha was pointing out to them, the Brahmins, they worship fire outside, you see. They put the fire outside and worshipped it. The Buddha is saying now the fire's inside. Fire's in your own heart. So when he heard about that, they were all became arahants. They're already on the cusp of awakening, you see. So when they heard that final teaching about turning inward, finding the truth within, and ridding yourself of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion, very, very clear to them. Then they all went to Rajagaha and met King Bimbisara. And King Bimbisara, he was the king of this, I guess it was a small kingdom then, Magadha. But he was very impressed with the Buddha. The Buddha invited the Buddha for a meal, and the Buddha offered him the bamboo grove. It was the first monastery, the Velawana. Bamboo grove in Rajagaha. So the Buddha received this property. This was a pleasure garden or something, like a little park in Rajagaha. So he received that as a gift to the Sangha. Became the first residence for the Sangha. And then shortly afterwards, his 2 chief disciples, Sariputta Moggallana, also came along and met the Buddha, and they were so impressed. They themselves were living with another teacher who was basically an agnostic. But when they were very popular disciples, and Sariputta was a very, very bright-minded person. He was the one who had the very, very quick mind, apparently. Very good speaker. So anyway, when he decided to join the Buddhas, 250 of the other disciples of this particular teacher, Sanjaya, they also went with him to the Buddha. So that's when we get 1,250 arahants. There's actually more, but we, hard to add them all up. 1,250 and 61 and 30 and might have been a few more in the interim too, but so these two, Sariputta and Moggallana, became the Buddha's two chief disciples. Moggallana was Sariputta was famous for being the most kind of very intelligent one and very, very quick-minded. So he gave some very, very you can say, intellectual discourses, which the Buddha praised and gave permission to have them in the Pali Canon. And Moggallana was proficient in samadhi, so he had great psychic powers. Apparently, he could sit in meditation very easily and had very, very powerful meditation practices. So that was the beginning of the Sangha. And then it kind of expanded from there. And so the development of the Sangha started off with just the Buddha himself and a few disciples, and then it began to grow. And I think probably the time the Buddha passed away, the Sangha was still not the main religion in India. Brahmanism was still very, very powerful. Probably even the Jains were more influential than the Buddha, but it slowly gained in popularity and partly because it was the social situation changed in India too. Became much more wealth came into the country and it developed, and so Buddhism was very flexible to be able to adapt. It didn't have this vegetarianism and these strict rules that Brahmins had. So it was very, very popular for the merchant class of people. Many merchants became Buddhists, joined the Buddhist following. And then they spread that, outside of India over the Silk Route to China. And I don't think maybe some merchants came to America, England. They go everywhere. Business people, so anyway, it spread anyway, so. And then as it went to different places, it also, because being quite adaptable, it also adapted to the time and place. So we have, for example, went to China. Chinese culture is very different than the Indian culture. One of the differences was that the Chinese people do not like beggars, apparently. So the monks had to settle down. They couldn't be beggars anymore. They had to settle in monasteries, grow their own rice. And then they took on the local clothes. They wear more like the Chinese, whatever they call them, pajamas or something, rather than this kind of robe. But I was talking to one Zen monk he was trained in Japan, or his teacher was from Japan anyway, and they had this black Mahayana robes on, but they have this square thing in front here they put on. And he was showing me these. See the pattern on this, he said? This pattern's the same as your robe, he said. No. They still keep that piece of the monk's robe with the paddy fields of Magadha in it. Just to show them that was, back from the Buddha's time, you see. But then they wear black Chinese clothes, after that, so. Anyway, that was from one person, the Buddha being awakened, finding the way to the deathless. It had influence on many, many other people. And it spread around the world eventually now. So that nowadays it's some people still find it very useful to, at least to study and practice the Buddha's teachings. They find some benefit from it. So. From that, the next lessons will be about what the Buddha taught, his teachings. So I think that should be enough for lesson 1.